Hello, everybody, and welcome to the Coalition Evaluation Webinar Series. We are joined by lots and lots of people today, so that's good news. My name is Dr. Bill Geary, and I'm here in Doylestown, Pennsylvania, with Andrea De La Flor. For those of you who are new to this, this is part of an ongoing webinar series that we're doing. We've been doing since, I think, April. And all of these webinars are on some aspect of evaluation. Andrea and I are both with Global Evaluation Solutions, and we offer this monthly along with other training videos on our YouTube site, which we'll talk about later. We're very ecstatic today to have two new things going on. First, we've never had this many people on a webinar. I think Andrea's sitting here with me, but I think back in April we had like 15 people on our first one, and we have over 220 registered for today. And I'm sure that part of that is for the second thing, not just the growth, but we're very happy to have some guests with us today who are going to talk about their cutting edge research. So before I hand it over to Marc and Heather and John, I'll have them introduce themselves. But first, for those of you who have not been on this webinar before, I just want to walk through a couple of things. You'll notice that everyone has a control panel that has various functions on it, but also includes handouts. You can download those directly onto your desktop now or whenever is convenient for you. One of them is the contact information for role agreement survey, which Marc is going to talk about a little bit, along with the role expectation and the role agreement surveys. At some point, Marc and his team will be talking about all three of those, and he was nice enough to make those documents available. One of them is the PDF to this PowerPoint, and everyone should also be aware that this is being recorded and will be placed on the Coalition Evaluation YouTube channel by the end of the day. If folks have questions, there is a little box that says type question here. Feel free as we're going through the webinar to talk about, if you have any questions as we're going through, type your questions there. We do provide some pauses to address questions, but because of the number of people on this webinar, we're going to be keeping track of everyone's questions and talking about the ones that I think are, if people are asking the same kinds of questions, we may pick just one or two or three, something that represents what people may be asking. Please be aware that because of the number of people, we may not be able to answer every question if there are a lot of questions during the webinar, but we will, of course, answer all questions afterwards because we have everyone's email, and GoToWebinar does record all of your questions. So Andrea and I always go into the system afterwards and make sure that we answer everything that needs to be answered. And so having said that and brought up her name twice, I'd like Andrea to say hello. She's going to be handling the logistics, kind of talking about what she's going to do today. Miss Andrea.
Hi, everyone. This is Andrea De La Flor. Bill already introduced me a little bit. Of course, I'm with Global Evaluation Solutions with Bill, and he already told you about what we do. We've been doing these webinars, and we provide services and supports to coalitions. You can contact us at any time, and our contact information is here. But I'm basically going to be tracking everybody's questions today, and Bill and I are also going to sort of play a role of facilitator, you could say, of the conversation. So there are a few points where we've actually blocked off for questions, and you'll see that the slide will come up, and there's you'll see it's an image for questions. And that's a time when everyone will be able to just, like Bill said, use the chat box, and we will all be monitoring those questions. And that time will also be a time that Bill and I might add some things or even some questions that we have or just sort of some context. So I think that covers all of the housekeeping bits. And so I'm going to go ahead and pass it along to our wonderful presenters today. We're so thankful again to them. They're doing this at no cost for all of you today and in support of just basically trying to get good information out to coalitions and other groups who are interested in it. So thank you so much for being here, and I'm going to go ahead and pass it to you, Marc, to do some introductions on your end.
Okay. Well, good afternoon or good morning to all of you, depending on where you are. I wanted to thank Bill and Andrea for giving us this opportunity to make this presentation about some of the work that we've done. If you can go to the next slide. Okay. No, that isn't Paul Newman, that's me. I wanted to give you a little background about myself. I am a former professor of psychology for 33 years at Central Connecticut State University, where I taught courses in primary prevention and in organization development in our master's program in community psychology. And along with my teaching, I also did a lot of applied research work with community organizations, mostly community coalitions, through the university's Center for Public Policy and Social Research. Since retiring a few years ago, I've continued to do program evaluation work and other applied research with coalitions as a private consultant. Okay, I'll turn it over to Heather.
Hi everyone, I'm Heather Sapere. I'm a data analyst at the Child Health and Development Institute in Farmington, Connecticut. I have my BA and MA degrees in psychology from Central Connecticut State University, and for the past 3 years or so I've been working with Marc as an assistant evaluator for various drug-free community coalitions in Connecticut.
Hi everyone, my name's John Daviau. I'm a community psychologist and have worked with community anti-drug coalitions here in Connecticut for about 20 years. I've worked with drug-free community coalitions, strategic prevention framework, state incentive grant coalitions, the Partnership for Success coalitions, and even some block grant funded coalitions. And my work with them has included grant writing, strategic prevention framework, and environmental strategies consulting, and of course, coalition organizational development consulting. I've been kind of a soup to nuts coalition consultant here. I'm also the executive director of the Connecticut Association of Prevention Professionals, a professional association that, as the Connecticut Smart Approaches to Marijuana chapter, is devoted to defeating recreational legalization of marijuana here in Connecticut.
Okay, I'd like to give some context as why we were interested in doing this study. First issue is sort of our belief in the potential of coalitions. Let me just say for myself that I was in college and in graduate school during the tumultuous 1960s and saw firsthand the power that ordinary citizens could have by banding together. It was the ultimate demonstration of Margaret Mead's famous quote, "Never doubt that a small group of thoughtful, committed citizens can change the world. Indeed, it is the only thing that ever has." So I've had the opportunity to work both professionally and as a volunteer member of a number of different coalitions, and I've seen them accomplish some amazing things. On the other hand, our experience of working with coalitions has also pointed out some of the sort of the downsides. There are many ways that coalitions can be ineffective, and many of these, the reasons for this can be kind of traced back to an understanding, the failure of coalitions to understand the true nature of what a coalition is supposed to be. When governments, both at the federal and state level, and large foundations began to fund coalitions to address various complex community problems, they recognized that ongoing staffing was needed to handle the logistics of keeping the organization on track and providing some continuity. I personally don't believe that staff members were ever thought of as the people to lead the coalition and to provide most of the people power to get things done. But unfortunately, for a variety of reasons, some of which we'll address today, the role of staff people often got mucked up. That's a technical term. And coalition members often began seeing them as the people doing the work of the coalition. This has many negative consequences for the coalition. The idea of exploring how volunteer and paid staff members saw their roles in coalitions became of interest to me, and that led me to propose to John and Heather that we look at the question of role expectations in a systematic way. Okay, on to the next slide. What we're going to try to cover today, I'd like to talk about our work on role expectations among paid staff and volunteer members of coalitions. We hope to give you some ideas on where roles are often confused between staff and volunteers, some techniques for exploring role agreement in your own coalition, and some ways to use this information to make your coalition more effective. Specifically, we're going to talk about 4 areas. First, we're going to talk about what we mean by role confusion in coalitions. We'll give a definition, talk about some of the research that has looked at role confusion in coalitions, provide a couple of brief case examples, and then talk about some of the factors that contribute to this problem. Next, we'll talk and describe our research on role expectations among paid staff and volunteers in a national sample of drug-free coalitions. Third, we'll discuss how survey data can be used to clarify and negotiate roles and expectations in individual coalitions. And fourth, we'll talk about the role that evaluation consultants can serve as organization development advocates in the coalitions they work with. As Bill mentioned, we have built in some time for questions at several points during this presentation, so you can submit them by typing them into the chat box. We'll begin by having Heather talk a little bit about what we mean by role confusion and a brief review of some of the research on the impacts of role confusion on coalition functioning.
Okay, so when we talk about role confusion, we're referring to when paid staff and volunteer members differ in their expectations of who is responsible for accomplishing certain tasks. For example, as a paid staff member, I might be expecting volunteer members to be primarily responsible for task A, while volunteer members feel that accomplishing that task is primarily the responsibility of the paid staff member. One example is who should be responsible for leading meetings. If paid staff feel their primary responsibility is providing logistic support, they may feel that meeting leadership should fall on the members themselves. Or volunteers might feel that the role of paid staff is to lead the coalition and its meetings. This difference in perspective can lead to problems. Similar issues might come up regarding who is responsible for educating the larger community about the coalition and its mission, or who is responsible for determining the coalition's priorities and strategies. These and many similar issues are not either-or questions. We believe that accomplishing the important tasks that all coalitions must do to be successful is an artful blend requiring a delicate balance between the volunteer and paid staff roles. Too much dependence on the paid staff to be the workhorse of the coalition undermines the purpose of having a coalition. And too great an expectation on volunteers to manage the many details of day-to-day operation is equally a recipe for failure. A good balance in which everyone is clear on what is expected of them is our best hope for success. So there have been several research studies and informal case studies of coalitions that inform us of some of the consequences of role confusion. So today I'd like to discuss 4 key impacts. And the first impact is burnout, overload, and stress among paid staff members. Paul Evanson and Shannon Weatherly, based on their considerable experience, respectively, as an evaluator and coalition leader, developed a PowerPoint presentation entitled The Art of Not Knowing Everything, the Role of Paid Staff in Coalitions. And this is not an empirical study, but the presentation reflects their accumulated wisdom from being in the field. So among the actions that paid staff should not do, they listed always be the spokesperson for the coalition, be the primary implementer or act alone, and deny members a chance to act on any action that a member should or could have taken. Paul and Shannon then talked about the consequences of doing these should nots, and they noted the following negative impacts. The coalition becomes the paid staff, members leave because they have no real roles, and staff members will burn out. Okay. The next impact is lack of commitment to the coalition or organization. Wandersman and Alderman studied volunteers working with the American Cancer Society, which is an organization that's largely volunteer-driven. At the time of the study, the ACS had about 2.5 million volunteers nationwide and 3,000 paid staff, which is a ratio of one staff person for about every 833 volunteers. And one part of their study looked at the clarity of role expectations for volunteers, and they noted the lack of structure in many volunteer organizations often leaves the volunteer unsure of his or her role within the organization, and this may contribute to the volunteer's perceived lack of commitment to the organization. The third impact is delays in project development. Goodman et al. Did a case study of a coalition set up for diabetes prevention among African Americans in North Carolina. The project was a complex one requiring considerable coordination among several groups of stakeholders, including federal organizations that funded local projects, state public health agencies, and local community groups that participate in project planning and policy setting. The case study compared the proposed implementation as described in the grant proposal with the actual implementation as obtained from interviews with different stakeholder groups. This qualitative study revealed several positive benefits arising from the project, but also some areas which needed improvement. So the main operational problem was the delay in implementing the project. This in turn was attributed to two issues. First, inadequate communication, coordination, and cooperation among stakeholder groups. And second, conflict over project roles and goals. The origin of these difficulties was traced back to inadequate time at the beginning of the project spent on formational activities where resources are gathered, partnerships developed, and capacities built. In other words, insufficient time was spent on getting people to the table and working out the expectations regarding what the project was trying to accomplish and the roles that the various stakeholder groups would play in relation to each other. And then the last impact I'd like to discuss is lower levels of implementation and a lack of sustainability. Rogue et al. Examined 12 collaboratives located in urban areas across the U.S. that were working on violence prevention. Their study looked at coalition sustainability, which they defined broadly to include funding and resources, but also included the extent to which a collaborative continues to be operational, cohesive, and growing. So they classified the 12 collaboratives into 5 categories of development, ranging from expansion, meaning the coalition was growing, down to a category called non-operational, meaning essentially that the collaborative was no longer in operation because of internal administrative problems. And they looked at a number of variables based on their review of the literature that they believed might be related to sustainability. And one of the factors consistently associated with sustainability in the collaboratives they studied was clear delineation between the roles of staff and collaborative members. So now John's going to provide some brief case examples of these consequences from his experience.
As Heather and Mark have mentioned, role confusion can come in a lot of different forms. One coalition that I've worked with in the past, the volunteers really did not see a role for themselves as coalition leaders, despite the efforts of the staff. Staff struggled to get volunteers to accept leadership positions because those volunteer leaders, obviously, they really helped to increase community ownership and also coalition sustainability. Finally, when a single volunteer of the member of the coalition started to understand this value and agreed to become the coalition chairperson, she led the coalition for about 5 months. Unfortunately, she was really alone in this gained insight, and when a family emergency required her to leave the coalition leadership position, the whole volunteer leadership concept really kind of imploded on the coalition, and it took them about 6 more months. It took this coalition about 6 more months to really establish volunteer leadership by helping the members see the value of that. And another coalition that already had incredible community support and leadership, both volunteer and staff members had become a little bit too comfortable with each other and maybe even trusting of each other, they stopped paying attention to some of their established decision-making protocols. Both volunteers and staff started making decisions related to an action plan activity without following their procedures and checking in with each other. This led to both role confusion about who was making decisions, but also their first real conflict between volunteers and staff. And it took a little bit of a mini retreat to kind of sort that out for themselves and realizing that, oh, they just kind of forgot to follow their established communication procedures. Finally, an example demonstrating just the opposite, when role agreement and positive coalition outcomes can really come together. A drug-free community coalition that I worked with was applying for their year 6 funding. They established a planning committee that, with great volunteer input, established new logic models from their most recent and their trend data. They prioritized their risk and protective factors and really developed an action plan based on those new logic models. As they went through this planning process, the volunteer members of the coalition really, obviously, this built a great deal of ownership for the action plan. And those volunteers started identifying their roles in the action plan and really started better understanding what staff roles were even before their funding for year 6 was received. So Marc's going to talk briefly now about some of the dynamics which contribute to the creation of this role confusion.
So hi everybody, this is Bill Geary again. Just to remind, if people have questions, to go ahead and type them into the chat window. As I said, we'll make sure that we address all of them, even if we don't do them all today. It looks like there's some stuff coming in now, so we're taking a look at those. In the meantime, I just wanted to again thank Marc and his crew for reviewing that literature. I think as a 2-time coalition coordinator myself, I think sometimes research, we forget that there's actually a lot of people doing a lot of research on things that could help us as a coalition. And I think listening to that list that you went through, Marc, definitely resonated with me as a former coalition leader. Just lots of the same issues, particularly the hit the ground running thing, I think is really important. And so what I'd like to do, though, is, since kind of that's my background, we do have a poll that we want to launch just to get a feel for all of you out there. If you could just tell us kind of what role you're playing today on this webinar, so that all of us, including Marc and his team, can kind of figure out who they're talking to today. So if you could just select if you're a paid staff person representing a coalition today, if you're a volunteer member representing a coalition, or if you are not representing a coalition today, and we'll let you know how that turns out. I know that you won't be able to see that on your screen, but it looks like it's about 2/3 of you have voted overwhelmingly. This looks like paid staff people representing coalitions. So we're about 88%, just so you know. We'll give you another 5-6 seconds or so but it doesn't look like the numbers are going to change. This is so weird.
Let's
Just
go
having
out and
the election-
convince them
Yes.
to come and listen to these webinars and learn about how coalitions should be functioning, right?
Yeah. So thank you everyone for voting on that. It looks like about 86% fall into the first category. About 8% are volunteers. 5% are not. 5 or 6% not representing a coalition today. And so I'm just going to give Andrea a chance to look at some of the questions that we have up and see if there's anything you think we should address right now. Andrea.
Okay, so Erica Clark asks, is there anything in the literature or in your experience that points to the time frame as to when these kinds of issues surfaced for coalitions?
Well, I think the issue of like hitting the ground running obviously happens pretty early on. Oftentimes, shortly after the money arrives, there's a feeling like, okay, now they've given us a lot of money. We really got to do something with it. So I think that oftentimes a lot of these problems that we've mentioned may not always surface right away, but almost always are related to a failure of doing sort of the necessary background work or groundwork before the coalition gets going. And I know this is often difficult for groups because they really do want to get out there. They feel excited and they want to accomplish something. And oftentimes dealing with structures and processes seems rather boring or whatever and not what they signed on for. And yet it's very critical in the long-term success of the coalition. John, do you have any thoughts on that too?
Yeah, I would just add that it really depends on the individual coalition's developmental process and how they're growing or not growing. The coalition that I mentioned previously that had some confusion about decision-making processes. They were in their 5th year as a drug-free community grantee, and this had never come up before, and all of a sudden it came up for them. So I've seen it, from the very beginning, midway or towards the end. It keeps coming back up if you don't pay attention to it.
Okay, so we have another question from Ken McManus. I think it's a question that a lot of coalition staff, coalition leaders have. The question is, what suggestions do you have with regard for moving from a paid staff? Does it all, I'm sorry, there's a little typo there. I think the question is, how do you move from a paid staff kind of doing it all to having more active roles for coalition members? So basically any steps that you all maybe as researchers have or through your experiences seen in terms of moving people in this direction. And he also mentions thoughts about that we could include about dealing with an executive board and general members whose attendance and follow through are erratic. It's basically the same issue here.
Very good question and not an easy one to answer. Hopefully some of the information we present a little bit later in this webinar will somewhat address that. But clearly it's a matter of kind of establishing a culture where people understand what the coalition is. And I think people do get confused thinking that their role is strictly, I come to my monthly or bi-monthly meeting, I say my piece, and then I go home again. And I think that it has to be made clear, particularly early on when the coalition is forming, or certainly when you're orienting members. If coalitions do typically have some turnover in members, and you need to have some sort of training or orientation process, I think it's important that that be put out there in the beginning, that this is our expectation of what being a coalition member is, that you will participate between meetings. You will help out in various capacities. So I think that is the $64 question. How do you change that once it's started going the other way? And it does take some work. John?
Yeah, I think one of the big issues that we tend to not pay enough attention to is what are our members' self-interests? Why are they there? And I think that once we can really identify what has brought a coalition member to the table, kind of what makes them tick, what motivates them to be there, and then how can we use that, build on that to increase their interest. You know, people don't have a lot of time, but the fact is that people will spend time when they see it as really benefiting them or an issue that they're really committed to. So I think that the whole issue of understanding the self-interests of our members, and again, I don't mean that in a negative way, the self-interest idea. We all have our own self-interests for being involved in whatever we get involved in. And so better understanding those. I've worked with coalitions that have actually gone through some very upfront coalition meetings, structural meetings, and talked about what our self-interests are. It's a very helpful process.
Okay, well, we're going to go ahead and get back to the presentation. Let me just close this poll, and it looks like I'm going to have to start the presentation again. I'm not sure what's going on here, but just to let you know about the poll. So 82% of you vote, 87 voted, 82% said I'm a paid staff person, and 8% a volunteer member, and 10% of you are not representing a coalition today. So let me go ahead and get back to this little bit of a finicky thing here. Now I'm going to get to the next slide. And you all should be seeing it in a second. I'm very sorry about that. Hopefully that won't happen again. So we're on.
Okay, so I'm just going to review the rationale for our study first. So we've talked about role confusion and have cited some evidence from the research literature. And we've also given some examples from our own experience, but we were interested in seeing how widespread the issue of role confusion was in the universe of drug-free community coalitions where we do most of our work. All right, so what we did first, we obtained a list of all the DFC coalitions from a government website, and we randomly selected 69 coalitions, so about 10% of all the DFC coalitions in the U.S. And then we searched the internet to get email addresses and other contact info. Then we emailed and in some cases called the coalitions to explain the study and asked if they wanted to participate in completing a survey. We asked that staff people complete the online survey and that they distribute the survey link to the volunteer members of their coalition for them to complete it. And as an incentive to participate, we told coalitions if they had 10 or more members complete the survey, so at least 1 paid staff and 9 volunteer members, we would prepare an individualized report for them on their data. To develop the survey instrument, we brainstormed key coalition activities from our experience, reviewed the key action steps from the Strategic Prevention Framework, and sought out suggestions from paid staff and volunteers from coalitions in Connecticut. And after we came up with a list, we circulated it back to staff and volunteer members to assess the clarity of the items. And we ended up with 37 items. And the survey instrument and all of our procedures were reviewed and approved by the Institutional Review Board at Central Connecticut State University. So this slide shows you part of the survey, and you should have received a shortened version of the survey from Bill and Andrea. So if you have that available, this would be a good time to take a quick look at it. As you can see, for each item, the respondent is asked to circle the number indicating who they felt was responsible for doing the action. And they had 5 choices, ranging from saying the paid staff was totally responsible to saying the volunteer members were totally responsible. And the survey version that you received is a shortened version that contains 6 questions. But if you'd like the full 37-question version of the survey, you can contact Marc via email for that. And now John's going to talk about our final sample and analysis strategy.
So we ultimately received about 313 responses from individuals representing 36 out of the 69 coalitions we contacted. Unfortunately, some people who received the survey did not take it seriously or only completed a few of the items. So we decided to set criteria that we would only include a survey in our analysis if the respondents answered at least half of the survey items. We also didn't include data from the coalition if there wasn't at least one survey completed by a staff member and at least one by a volunteer member. So putting these restrictions in place reduced our final sample to 251 people from 22 coalitions, slightly less than 1/3 of the coalitions we had originally contacted. We expected that the role expectations regarding paid staff and volunteer members would vary more between coalitions rather than within them because of the differences in how coalitions may have worked to clarify roles. So consequently, we felt that the best way to analyze the data was to treat the coalition as the unit of analysis, not the individual member of each coalition. So therefore, we separately computed the mean score for each of the survey items for volunteer members and then for paid staff, and used these mean scores to make comparisons across coalitions. Marc and Heather will now talk about the results of our comparisons across coalitions.
Okay. This slide shows you how we visually portrayed the data. On the left-hand side, we've put the first few words of the survey item. The red and blue lines represent the data. The red line represents the mean scores across coalitions of the volunteer members, and the blue line represents the mean score of the staff members. Please note the red and blue lines do not have any connection with political party affiliation. When the lines are just about on top of each other, it means that the expectations of the volunteer members and the paid staff about who is responsible for the task are nearly identical. When there is a space or gap between them, it means that the expectations are somewhat different. So what we are looking for are the larger gaps, which represent larger differences in expectations. As we can see on this graph, the larger gaps are for items like sharing coalition meetings, leading the implementation of coalition activities, and sharing committee meetings. The facts that the means of the paid staff are further to the right-hand side means that they tend to see these actions as ones that should be more equally shared or taken on by volunteer members. The remaining items, besides those three, show pretty good agreement between staff and volunteer members regarding who should be responsible.
So rather than going through several slides like the last one, we've summarized on 2 slides where paid staff and volunteer members generally agreed and disagreed regarding role expectations. So this slide shows the 10 items where there was the greatest degree of agreement. 4 of the 10 actions are items that both paid staff and volunteer members see as things that should be equally shared in accomplishing. Encouraging others to attend coalition-supported events, attending meetings, serving as role models for young people, and appreciating cultural differences in the community and how proposed coalition activities might impact them. And then the remaining items are all actions which both staff and volunteers see as more the responsibility of the staff. These include attending external meetings when the issues of coalition interest are on the agenda, more technical activities like creating a logic model, examining community data, and working with the evaluator, and logistical actions such as creating meeting agendas or providing material support. Now John's going to talk about the survey items where there was the largest degree of disagreement between staff and volunteers.
So this slide shows the 10 items where there was the largest degree of disagreement on role expectation between paid staff and the volunteer members. The 5 items listed in italics are those where there was a statistically significant difference between the scores. 5 of the 10 items were ones that the staff thought should be equally shared in terms of responsibility between staff and volunteer members, but which volunteers saw as more the responsibility of staff. These included the 2 events dealing with media, sharing information about coalition events on personal social media such as Facebook, and secondly, writing letters or op-ed pieces about coalition activities for a local newspaper. 2 actions involved with meeting leadership, leading coalition meetings or committee meetings, and then one of a more technical nature, prioritizing risk and protective factors that the coalition would try to address through coalition activities. The remaining 5 were perceived as somewhat more the responsibility of staff by both staff and volunteers, but there was still a large gap between the 2 groups. 4 of these 5, paid staff saw them involving somewhat more responsibility on the part of volunteers. These actions included, again, media-related items, maintaining and updating the coalition website and social media, and keeping the local media informed about coalition activities. One, again, was a logistical activity, finding and securing meeting locations, and one with leadership and implementing coalition activities. The final item was interesting in that it was the only one where volunteer members rated it more in the direction of being a shared responsibility than did paid staff. And that dealt with educating coalition and community members on the conceptual framework that guides coalition activities. Finally, I would like to add that even though we found larger differences between staff and volunteers when we compared across coalitions, it does not necessarily mean that if you looked at the pattern for any one coalition, these would necessarily be the biggest gaps. Each coalition is likely to have their own unique pattern of differences. So again, time for a question break. We can take your questions at this point.
Sure, thanks. And just so everybody knows, one of the limitations from Marc's end and his team is that he's not able to see the questions. That's why we're building in these breaks, because Andrea and I, as the host of the webinar, are seeing them. I just wanted everybody to be aware of the logistics and how that's working out. And we have a lot of questions, Marc, just so you know that a lot of them I think we're going to hold off until the end because there's a lot of questions on implementation. How do you have the conversation and all of that? And I want to give you guys the opportunity to talk about your stuff about what an evaluator can do. But then thinking about all the folks who are asking this question, kind of like, how do you have this conversation? I think the other thing that's interesting in the comments, and certainly as an observer, and again, maybe it would be best to speak to this in the next section, but a lot of people I think are legitimately asking the question about how do you have that conversation with volunteers, because there's a staff perception, which is accurate, I think, that, you know, volunteers are in fact volunteers, and we don't want to chase people away by kind of trying to convince them that they should be doing more, right? So thinking about kind of what are not just the strategies in terms of how you have the conversation, but then what are some potential strategies for addressing that really important issue that volunteers may feel like, well, you know, because, well, to frame it, right, in my experience, we have a handful, I'm sure you guys have noticed this too, right? You have a handful of coalition members who are doing most of the work, and you have a whole bunch of volunteers who are hardly doing anything. So part of this conversation may be that an evaluator can help with, and you guys could talk about later, maybe not necessarily right now because you still have to present this part, but thinking about what are the different models for getting work redistributed, I think. And then the last thing that I'm noticing in the questions, which I think is a really valid concern, again, I went through this myself, is how do you convince staff members, and a couple of people referred to this specifically saying, look, I'm the staff person, I'm responsible for how much movement occurs. And so it's thinking about what are the justifications, maybe even from an evaluation standpoint, what are the kinds of things that you could be using as measures that you're making progress if you have to kind of slow business down a little bit to redistribute the work? What do you tell your funder now in terms of what is it that you're accomplishing? Since even the DFC, right, is so interested in the core measures and all that, what role can an evaluator play in framing? What are the kinds of indicators you could be looking at and explaining how it's working, even though you may not be getting as much done to funders and to other community members. So just thinking those are the three big themes that we see coming up with the questions.
Okay, and so I also wanted to just point out one of the comments that someone made here before I went into questions. So Colleen Bainick, I hope I pronounced your name correctly, she just commented that one major assistance to them has been going to the action-oriented agenda with highlighted and assigned action items in the minutes, and then holding participants accountable in the follow-up meetings. And I know that that's something that a lot of coalitions do. So I just wanted to point out that good comment there. So a question, one person wanted to know, and I have not seen any research on this, but you all are researchers, maybe will have some thoughts. How many hours per month can you really expect from a volunteer?
That's a great question.
You want an answer now?
Head Mark. 2, 3.
So much depends on each volunteer. It just varies so much. I'm familiar with volunteers who literally have put in, multiple hours each and every week for, very extended periods of time. And then I know other volunteers who, they're not available. You call them once a month or a few times a year, and they can take care of one or two things for you. And that's as much as they can handle. So it really depends. And again, it's always a gem when you find that person who's really willing to put in significant time. I know a coalition where a volunteer member has managed their coach training program, training coaches in prevention strategies, and she's been doing this for the last 3 years, and it's been very time-consuming for her.
One possibility, too, is it may make some sense to have sort of different levels of membership. There are certainly some people in some coalitions who provide a lot of material support. I've worked with some where there's a particular restaurant that provides meals when they have, or provides catering when they go out to have public meetings. Other people provide printing assistance, printing up flyers, and so on. But none of those people can actually make it to the meetings because of the time. And so there may make some sense to say that there are levels of membership. There are some people that you may call upon just for certain types of material support that's important, but you recognize that they're not going to be able to be involved in the more regular meetings that you have, and that you may have a more active group of members that provide other kinds of things. As John mentioned, I think you really have to find out what motivates individual members and try to be creative in shaping tasks that fit their particular skills and interests.
I could also mention, just getting at something that Bill said earlier, is that when you're trying to, as you're trying to motivate coalition members to be involved, I think it's critical to, and started mentioning some of this before, and building on what Marc is saying, critical to understand not only what motivates them, but also some pieces of, what some of their limitations might be. They may be dealing with a limitation at work. Maybe they're a police officer and they attend during their, during their work hours, and so they may have some limitations on them from that perspective as well. So, in terms of how much time they can participate, how much time they have to offer to the coalition, may have some other outside limitations that don't have anything to do with how they think about it.
Yeah, and so hey everybody, this is Bill Geary again, and I think a lot of that has to, I had a thought as Marc and John were talking about that. I think a lot of that has to do with your initial negotiation with the volunteer in terms of getting a real good understanding of what are their time constraints. But I think the other thing that it calls out is sometimes volunteers will volunteer, but they're not really sure how much time it takes. So, for example, the one that Marc was just talking about, it's possible that this person volunteered not realizing how much work it was going to be, but then was uncomfortable in saying, this is too much work. I need to kind of bail out a little bit. Maybe there was not a mechanism for that person to be able to do that. So I think as a coalition leader, it's really important, especially with new members, to keep tabs on what they're doing and to continue to have the conversation. I think we often focus on just having a conversation at the very beginning of the volunteer experience. I think it's really important, especially for new volunteers, to have a conversation on a more regular basis with them, because there may be some who will look. If I'm a volunteer and I'm doing just fine with my hour a month, and I may be able to volunteer more, I may not really go to you as a coalition leader and go, hey, give me more work to do. But if you come to me and you say, hey, how do you feel right now? I may say, well, to be honest, I could do a little bit more. The opposite could be happening too. And so I think some of the issues that we were talking about with burnout and all that, that's part of that role expectation, that their role may shift as they start to get a better understanding of what the role is. And just real quickly, I think Andrea had 2 questions that we wanted to talk about right now that were related to this segment that you just did, Marc. So
one is a real quick one, Marc, just wondering to please tell them what year this coalition study was conducted.
We collected data, I believe, in the fall of 2015. I'm pretty sure. It's been about a year now since we presented it at a conference, and we are now in the process of, it's under review for publication right now.
Any differences in terms of time for youth volunteers, and if coalitions want to make them more involved in the process, how much do they really want to ask of them, especially for those youth that really want to be more active in the coalition? They're expressing that interest. And that was from Nicolette Morales.
Well, I always think it's great if you can get young people involved in the coalition. Many of them have time and energy, but I've found that varies a lot between coalitions. We didn't specifically ask about that, but that is a good point. I think that what I have seen when young people take an active role in the coalition, they can also have quite an impact on what gets done. In one coalition I worked with, some of the youth studied various stores in the town to see what kinds of drug paraphernalia were being sold and how they were being positioned in the store. And they were able then to go to the town council and propose legislation to actually require that all those kinds of things. They were also looking at e-cigarettes, that all those things had to be sort of behind the counter to make them less accessible and less prominent in the stores. But the amount of time that youth will be involved will vary across coalitions, and it kind of depends on what kind of relationships you've built with those youth.
Thank you so much. We're going to move on, and we still have more time for questions at the end.
Okay. I'd like to address now what I call the so what issue. While it might be interesting to see that there's these gaps across coalitions, how might a coalition meaningfully use this information? I want to make the case that for any individual coalition, taking the survey and plotting out the scores like we've done can serve as a trigger for meaningful discussion and renegotiation of role expectations between paid staff and volunteers. The use of survey data for this purpose is very commonly used as an organization development technique. The value that I see in this is that it has the ability to take what is implicit, what's in our heads, what are our expectations about roles, oftentimes assumptions that we make that we've never actually given voice to. And by using a survey or other kind of feedback techniques, you're making them public, which is a way of making them available for discussion. So I would argue that the value is that you can make a lot of what's implicit explicit, where you can then talk about it and begin a negotiation process. So how do you do this? In a nutshell, here are some of the steps that you might follow. I think first off, you're going to have to establish a goal for a survey activity. For example, saying that it's to improve communication and get greater clarity of expectations. What you need to do is provide a rationale and motivation to get coalition members to complete the survey, because certainly I've had experiences where maybe less than half of the coalition wants to participate in any kind of survey that has to do with anything that might smack of evaluation and so on. So I think you have to build some motivation to get people to participate. Then to have people, volunteers, and paid staff member complete the survey online, and I can, John, I, and Heather can help you with some of the technology of how to do that. You then analyze the staff and volunteer member data separately, as we kind of showed in that one of the slides, and create some sort of visual display of sort of where are the perceptions of staff members, where are the perceptions of the coalition members. Then once you've got that available, establish a meeting time to discuss this information. I would not recommend a regular meeting unless you have at least 45 minutes to devote to this task. It's going to take some time. Do not try to squeeze it in at the back end of a regular meeting. It would also be helpful to have a facilitator to help with this process. Someone who's maybe a member of the coalition who has had some experience facilitating groups. Because I think this is difficult to do if you're the staff person and I'm going to be responding to some of these issues, as well as trying to manage the meeting. It may be helpful to have someone else who can assist with that. Okay. At the meeting where you're going to process this, review again the purpose of why you're meeting and sort of the ground rules. Most organizations, coalitions, have some kind of general understanding about how meetings will be conducted in terms of how we treat each other. Be respectful. These kinds of meetings are never to blame people. You do want people to share their actual honest thoughts and feelings about this. So you kind of maybe have to outline that to encourage people to take the risk to participate. I think the next step is you present the data on paper and perhaps in some graphic as we've done it, and have participants work in small groups to look for the biggest gaps, maybe 3 or 4 of the biggest gaps that they see. So you might have people working in groups of 4 or 5, depending on how many people you have at the meeting, and each group looks at this and decides which of these look like, there are bigger gaps, where there's a greater difference in expectations. Another thing to look for are any obvious patterns in the gaps. And by that I mean, do the largest gaps cluster around particular topics? For example, as the ones we've already showed, leading meetings is one area where people are oftentimes see that more as a responsibility of the staff. Or maybe issues around how do we interpret data, plan priorities, or issues around how do we use the media, how do we keep the community aware of what's going on. If they tend to cluster in one area, that may be an area where you need to do some kind of specialized training to help people feel more comfortable in doing those roles. So you're going to look at the gaps. You're only going to discuss the ones that are larger, and you'd like both the staff and members of the coalition to share why did they scale the item the way they did? Why did they see this as a task that should be done more by staff or more by themselves, and vice versa for the staff members? And what you want to focus on is how do we move towards more mutually acceptable role expectations? How can we clarify what we do? What are we going to need to change? What behaviors? What are we going to have to be doing differently? And what types of supports would make the staff and volunteers more comfortable in doing these things? As I just suggested, if there's certain things that people are very hesitant to do, for example, leading meetings, you might have to provide some training or assistance in helping people feel more comfortable in those kinds of roles. Not just sort of throw it at them, but say, we can do some things and we can talk about how that process would work. And as you establish these new expectations, Be sure that you incorporate them in writing in your training and orientation materials, in your bylaws or operating principles. Not only should you discuss them, but you should write them down, and they should become part of the sort of established lore of your coalition. And so the new members and old members, if they need to refer to it, have a better understanding of what have we agreed to as our sort of operating strategies. Okay. As we sort of wind down this webinar, I'd like to end with the following challenge. I would like to challenge the evaluation people in our audience to expand the way you look at your role in your work with coalitions. Traditionally, evaluation work tends to focus on processes and outcomes. On the process side, we concern ourselves with questions like, do we meet the stated objectives regarding particular activities? Did we recruit as many new members as we said we would? Did we hold as many trainings or other community events as we stated in our 12-month plan? And on the outcome side, did we change attitudes about risks? And the biggie, did we reduce substance use levels? Now, these are all important things that evaluators should be focusing on. But I want to encourage evaluators to take more of an organization development perspective and to pay more attention in their observations and their data collection to the internal operating processes of the coalition. Indeed, it is my experience that the success of coalitions often hinges on the quality of these internal work processes. Things like, how do we make decisions? How do we handle conflict? What is the climate like at our meetings? How clear are our expectations of one another? And how satisfied are our members with the way we work together? Evaluation consultants are in a good position to see these operating processes in action if they regularly attend coalition meetings. Because if you're an evaluator, you wear an evaluation hat, you may actually have more license to say things that might be more difficult for others to say. By not simply being sort of a neutral observer, you can contribute data that can make the coalition more effective. Let me give you a very simple example. In one coalition I worked with, I noticed that at the meetings there was a clear divide between professionals, people who held advanced degrees and worked in sort of the human services arena, and parents and other concerned citizens. This latter group rarely spoke. I realized that at the first meeting that I attended, I was feeling intimidated because the professionals were throwing around acronyms and jargon that I didn't fully understand. Now, I'm sure it was never the intent of these professionals to intimidate other members of the coalition, but their language was clearly having a chilling effect. So I pointed this out to coalition staff members, and they began to encourage participants not to use jargon and acronyms without explaining them. And this, and also seeking out intentionally the participation of those who've largely been quiet. So sometimes just very simple observations about what's going on in the meeting can be very helpful in getting more people involved or seeing things that might be placing certain barriers in the way of people. You can also certainly use surveys and various other things to collect feedback on some of these kinds of internal issues that would be helpful for the coalition. John has more to say on this also.
Yeah, taking one of Mark's points a little further, volunteer management is really one of the most under-discussed and underrated skills that coalition staff really need to have. And this requires balancing, as we've kind of mentioned already, both those intrinsic and extrinsic motivation factors. You know, while a parent or a youth will likely be more intrinsically motivated, in their involvement with the coalition, we may need to know something about, their extrinsic motivation needs. And then for sector members that join a coalition during the work hours, right, our schools, our youth-serving organizations, our media, while they may be personally intrinsically motivated to be involved in the coalition, their supervisors may need to see the extrinsic value of their participation in order to keep allowing their attendance at coalition meetings or coalition events or activities. In essence, whether you're an evaluator or another type of consultant like myself, using a more participatory model fits much better with how coalitions operate. And if you understand some of the basic organizational development concepts and their applications, lending your expertise to improve coalition functioning really feels like more of an obligation to us than a choice. Okay, so now we have time for more questions.
Hey, Mark, this is Andrea. We are going to get to the questions here. And there have been, like Bill said, some kind of common themes. And so Greg Plyler, I don't want to butcher anybody's name.
Hi, Greg.
Hi, Greg, is asking something that I also, as a coalition project director, a DFC project director here in the New Hope, Pennsylvania area, it's definitely something relevant and of interest, and that is, as coalition leaders, there are very clear developmental stages of the coalition, right? So, for example, early on in the coalition's development, it is going to be staff doing a lot of this work, right? It has to be the staff setting up all of those systems and processes and kind of getting things to a place where they can even bring people in with some clear roles and responsibilities and really manage the volunteers in a really functional and effective way. So I think I wanted to ask you all a little bit more about the age of the coalitions, and forgive me if you did talk about it, but do you think that it's possible that some of these coalitions are in their earlier developmental stages? And how do you think that that maybe these perceptions among staff and volunteers might change over time throughout the development of a coalition?
Well, I think if you can address these issues early on, and I think one of the things that a coalition staff person can do, again, is to make that clear, that they may say, look, in the beginning, I'm going to be doing a lot of the work to sort of help you get organized, but also to reinforce the notion that your role is more on the logistics side to pull people together. But I think the rules and discussion about how we are going to operate really has to be a discussion where the members take the lead. It isn't your coalition. And if a staff person becomes sort of the whole coalition, that's really not what coalitions are supposed to be about. I think, though, that age can play an interesting role, particularly if the coalition, particularly if a funded coalition, existed as an organization that perhaps did not receive funding in previous years. When funding becomes available, and perhaps a staff member comes on, you have the fact that they have a culture that they've established for how they've dealt with things. And you may come in and realize that while that may have been okay for them in the past, that to be more effective and to make better utilization of the resources that they now have, they need to move in somewhat different directions. Frankly, I have seen coalitions where there's been a split between sort of the old guard members and more recent members. And in some cases, some of those old members actually leave the coalition. And oftentimes that is not a problem because, in fact, the newer people who've come in with expectations of being more active involvement actually do help the coalition. But you do have that issue that a culture has been established. Here's the way we do things, and now you're kind of there trying to rock the boat and move in a somewhat different direction, and you need to point out how that will be beneficial. And I think the issue is trying to figure out what people feel comfortable doing and not overburdening any individual with something that he or she does not want to do. But at the same time, hopefully you will have some members who do want to take on some more responsibilities and can move in that direction. It's probably never the case that all the members are going to be equally involved. It's an old rule, they call it, it's sometimes referred to as the 20-80 rule, where 20% of the members do 80% of the work. That seems to be true in almost every organization I've ever seen. But hopefully you can get that 20% involved and actively working. And, rewarding them for their work and always encouraging new members to participate.
I'd just like to add that since this was a random sample of drug-free community coalitions, we did have coalitions, at different years of development, and I don't have the breakdown of how many year ones or how many year 10s there were in the study here in front of me, but we did have a wide spread, so we did have very different ages in the coalition. And then just to kind of emphasize something Marc was just saying, all coalitions go through their cycles, and coalition could be really at the top of the heap and really functioning well, and then with some turnover and changes, whether it's volunteer members or staff or both, they can take a few steps back as far as how they work together.
Yeah, and I think piggybacking, sorry, this is Bill, piggybacking off of John's statement, which is piggybacking off of Mark's statement. This is, exactly this cycle, right? We know that from the organizational research, and for those of us experienced in organizations, that the number of years you've been around is not an indicator of your capacity, right? So there are lots of coalitions been around a long time, and they'll fluctuate back and forth, as you said, John, depending sometimes on membership or other types of external factors that will impact that. One of the things that I think this is very helpful for, because if we look at the organizational research in general, one of the indicators of capacity is clarity of role, right? So when we look at various surveys that are done in the organizational world, when corporations are measuring their capacity and other large organizations are measuring their capacity, one of the common capacity indicators is, do people know what they're supposed to be doing? And organizations where people have a great deal of differentiation on that, that correlates with lower levels of capacity. So I think the other thing that's important about this kind of instrument, or at least this kind of discussion, is this should not be a one and done kind of discussion, that this is actually one of the indicators that evaluators can use to assess the overall health of the organization. And so something like this might be good to do on a yearly basis, just to see if there are major changes and to keep track of those changes over time.
And I think that, Bill, what you just said speaks to something that Allison asked, which is if there was anything in the literature that talks about how long the coalition should exist before it revisits changes. I have not ever seen anything in the research literature that speaks to this specifically, but I think everyone on the call today has agreed that it's something that is important for coalition staff to keep close tabs on and just kind of keep the conversation going. And I think it's hard because each coalitions can be early in their kind of career as coalitions and be sort of start off with this really strategic planning process and engagement, and everyone knowing right in the beginning this idea that the volunteers are going to play a role, an active role in the work. But coalitions are started in so many different ways, right? And I know I've worked with a lot of coalitions and say DFCs who were around 20 years ago, but they just got the DFC grant. And I think someone else just mentioned, that it depends. When you get these grants, you're supposed to be now more strategic than you were before. And this really pushes the coalition in a direction that maybe it wasn't functioning in that way. Now kind of have to take a pause and sort of revisit things and figure out how to move forward and make it an active coalition. Another question that we have is, let's see, how would coalitions use the data that were presented to address gaps in perceptions in responsibility and in a responsible way and in terms of responsibilities between staff and volunteers? And there was another question just to be thinking about when you answer that, which is sort of, not stepping on people's toes and making sure that people still want to participate and you don't sort of scare them away and that you celebrate them when you're asking them to do more.
As far as how to do it, I think I've kind of outlined a process. Obviously, you need to collect information for them about how they do perceive the roles, and then where do we differ? Where do staff members and volunteer members differ? And let's talk about those and kind of renegotiate it. And that will be a delicate but important conversation. and some people will not be 100% happy with it. But I think you can go a long way to getting people more on the same page with that. And, it's always important, I think, as it's been suggested, that you have those conversations, maybe yearly or whatever, or if there's been any significant change in staff or membership. I did want to go back to one question that you asked before when we really didn't spend much time responding. You raised the question of what do we tell the funders if we suddenly are, if we're spending time reorganizing ourselves and we're, quote, not doing as much, won't that make us look bad? My experience is that most coalitions, when they write up their plan for what they're going to accomplish in any given years, oversell what they think they're going to do. I've never seen a coalition that has ever successfully completed all the items. So I sometimes think that coalitions would be better off reducing the number of things they're going to say they're going to do, but do those things better. In working, and I've had limited contact directly with DFC officers, program officers, but I've had some. My sense is most of them are very happy if you tell them the truth that, we bit off more than we can chew and we can't really do all these things, and now we're sort of stepping back and reorganizing. I've never heard a program officer, frankly, be upset with that. They're very happy that you're doing what it takes to get organized to be more effective.
Okay, great. So we're getting to the end here. There were a couple of questions about the presentation. Again, we are recording it and we're going to make it available. As far as who to contact also about the survey, you all have the handout, which is the entire PowerPoint slides, and also the small section of the survey that our presenters have been talking about, which if you want to get the full survey, their information is also included in the handouts, and you can certainly reach out to them about that, and they're happy to have a further conversation with you. Just before we go on and maybe do some last-minute questions while people jump off the line, we wanted to let you know that our next free webinar is going to be Tuesday, December 13th at 12 to 1:15. This one today was a little bit longer than our normal webinars. Subscribe to our YouTube channel if you can, and let Bill or I know if there's any topic that you want to hear, or if you have a success story to share, or really just some good information to share. I know one of the people had asked about if anyone has a orientation packet for new members to share. And with 120 people on the webinar right now, I'm sure that someone has a resource like that. And so please, if you do have an orientation packet example, or if you do have another person asked about ways to celebrate their volunteers that are putting a lot of work into the active coalition day-to-day functioning, that maybe you could share some ideas there as well. So please see us as a place where you can send information to us and we can then get it out to the whole group. And again, to contact Dr. Goldstein and his team about the survey. Again, I know some people are going to jump off, but we do have a little bit more time and for discussion and sort of wrapping up some thoughts. And I'm going to see if there are any other questions that we might want to address.
And while you're doing that, Andrea, I just want to thank Mark and Heather and John again. I think this is great work. I think the number of people who responded to our emails represents kind of the need in the field for you three in terms of this kind of research. And I'm hoping it gets published so that it gets even wider distribution. And I'm hoping that maybe we can do some follow-up on this kind of topic later. I think this is really important stuff. I think there was a lot of stuff that was brought up here today that's helpful for coalitions, and I know that Andrea and I certainly appreciate your work, and we certainly appreciate all the folks who registered and participated and all the questions. And as we said, if we didn't get to your question today, we are going to be looking at all of them and making sure that we reach out to folks. And again, if you have ideas about what to do, what to have a webinar on, please let us know, because that's how this started. Marc was part of our conflict resolution webinar, I think, last month, and reached out to us and said, hey, I got this thing that coalitions might be interested in. So it doesn't have to be kind of this kind of research. Certainly, if there are best practices or things that you think we could be doing stuff on, please let us know. And again, it's all available on the YouTube channel. So while Andrea is looking at the last few questions to address, I just wanted to thank everybody.
There was a question.
If you have a minute.
Oh, go ahead.
Go ahead. Well, this is John. I was just going to make an additional 2 points related to moving from a more staff-driven to member-driven coalition. And, the first point is reminding everybody in the coalition, staff and volunteer members alike, community itself. Obviously, we want to be successful in these efforts, and it takes a commitment. It takes time, and nobody wants to get involved in any kind of effort and have it be fruitless and have it be a waste of time. So I think that's an important point to make to all coalition members is it takes some time and effort to really make this a successful effort. We really need to work together. We need everybody involved. And at the same time, because we don't want to scare anybody away, everybody should feel comfortable with however much time they can offer to the coalition. Everybody's different. Everybody has different commitments and abilities and time frames and all that kind of stuff. And so certainly a coalition norm should be whatever time you can offer, we appreciate. So that's my 2 points.
Okay, thank you so much. There was one other question that I believe that I wanted to speak to. Well, someone asked about conflict resolution, and I did want to say that Bill and I had a webinar on conflict resolution recently, and that is, I believe it's on the YouTube channel. It is. And so that's one resource, and that's for Virgil asking about conflict resolution, because I do think that you do have to be a little bit careful, right? I'm imagining, so I'm going to sit everyone in a room, the volunteers and the paid staff, and kind of have them take this survey. And how do you facilitate that in a way that's going to be productive and not sort of pin paid staff versus volunteers against each other? I know there's a lot of the differences, while they may be small at times, there's a lot of passion behind them. So those people that feel differently about it might feel extremely differently about it, and there will be a need to have a conflict resolution. I honestly like to go to the research, right? So it's webinars like these, and also trying to keep up with any other research that's out there, and even the CDC puts out some good information, so that I can try to say, okay, this what I'm saying right now about how coalitions should be functioning is evidence-based, and if we want to be an effective coalition in the long term, when we don't have money to pay for our staff anymore, we have to begin moving in this direction. And the last thing we want to do is do it at the very end when it's too late and our funding is running out. So it's something that is just so critical in the beginning that we take the time to do. I think that's pretty much it with the questions. I'm going to let any of the presenters just say some final words, and just, again, thank you so much.
Well, I want to thank you, Andrea and Bill, for giving us this opportunity. I hope that it has been helpful for the participants. We look forward to hearing from them, and I wish you all the best with these coalition or these evaluation seminars. I think there's a great need for that, and I wish you all the best as you continue with them.
I'd just like to say that coalition work is some of the hardest work out there, and so congratulations to everybody who's still on this call for doing this difficult work. We need more of us.
Amen.
Okay.
I'll just say thanks for the opportunity to present this, and I hope everyone found it informative.
Okay, thank you so much. There were a couple of resources shared in the chat box for those of you who are still here. Take a look, and we will let you all go on with your day. Thank you so much, and please reach out to any of us with any questions. The conversation will continue, and you can expect to hear from us in an email with an evaluation on the webinar and also with all of the materials that we provided in the handouts today and maybe a couple of next steps. So have a great day, everyone.
Great. We'll give you a couple minutes before we sign off. Just one last thing. I close all of them this way. Having done this before, remember the words of the Eagles who sang, "Take it easy. Don't let the sound of your own wheels drive you crazy." So bye, everybody.